When Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer, why doesn't he just say, I must suffer? It's like he's talking about someone else entirely, but he's clearly referring to himself. Today we're exploring why Jesus speaks in the third person in books like Joshua, Jude, and Zechariah, what this linguistic pattern reveals about his divine nature, and how understanding this changes how we read scripture. By the end, you'll recognize these patterns and understand what they're actually communicating about Jesus' identity. Let me bring in someone who's spent serious time digging into this phenomenon and can help us understand what's really happening here.
This is actually a fascinating linguistic phenomenon that scholars call Iliism, when someone refers to themselves in the third person. And you're right to notice it, because according to research from Roderick Elledge, Jesus is the only person in the New Testament to use Iliism in direct discourse.
Wait, the only one? That seems significant.
Extremely significant. And here's what makes it even more interesting. This wasn't common in everyday ancient speech. Elledge's research found no evidence that Iliism was commonly used in direct speech in antiquity. When Greek historians used it, it was a rhetorical device for objectivity in their writings.
So Jesus is doing something unusual here. But you mentioned Joshua, Jude, and Zechariah. How does this show up in the Old Testament?
Great question. In Zechariah 3:2, we see this pattern. YHWH said to Satan, YHWH rebuke you, Satan. God is referring to himself in the third person. It's the same linguistic structure Jesus uses.
That's wild. So God the Father does this too?
Exactly. And according to Andrew Malone's research in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, this has been recognized since the first generations of New Testament believers as a significant tool for understanding hints of divine plurality in the Old Testament.
Okay, but let's step back. What exactly is Iliism, and why should we care about this linguistic quirk?
Iliism is third-person self-reference, when you talk about yourself using he, she, or your own name instead of I. The term was actually coined by Coleridge in 1809, but the phenomenon is ancient.
And this shows up in modern culture too, right? I'm thinking of politicians and celebrities.
Absolutely. Malone's research mentions politicians like Richard Nixon and Bob Dole, sports stars, and even fictional characters in influential works like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. But here's the thing, it's often associated with authority or status.
Interesting. So when someone uses third-person self-reference, they're making some kind of statement about their position or authority?
Exactly. And this is where it gets really fascinating with biblical usage. Elledge's study found that in the Old Testament, both kings and Yahweh use Iliism prominently. In ancient Near Eastern literature, it appears among kings and preeminent pagan gods.
So there's a pattern here. Royalty and divinity both use this speech pattern. That can't be coincidental.
Not at all. According to Elledge's research, in each case, the Iliism serves to emphasize the speaker's unique identity and authority associated with royal and divine status. It's a linguistic marker of elevated position.
Okay, so when Jesus says, the Son of Man must be delivered up, instead of I must be delivered up, he's not just being poetic, he's making a claim about his identity.
Precisely. And here's where it gets even more sophisticated. Research by Al Garza shows that Jesus alternates between first-person and third-person self-reference in a very deliberate pattern.
What do you mean by deliberate pattern?
According to Garza's study in the Journal of Biblical Monotheism and Plurality, Jesus' first-person speech, I, me, my, typically corresponds to his role as the incarnate Messiah, emphasizing obedience, dependence, and mission.
So when he's speaking as the human Jesus, he uses I.
Right, but his third-person references, the Son of Man, the Son, Jesus Christ, whom you have sent, consistently align with moments where he discloses divine prerogatives like pre-existence, authority to forgive sins, lordship over the Sabbath, and judgment of the world.
Wait, that's incredible. So the grammar itself is theological.
Exactly. Garza argues that this rhetorical pattern reveals a deliberate theological distinction embedded in the linguistic texture of the New Testament. It's not stylistic coincidence, it's a linguistic reflection of the hypostatic union.
The hypostatic union, that's the theological term for Jesus being both fully God and fully human in one person, right?
Correct. And according to Garza's findings, Jesus' shifting grammatical self-references serve as implicit theological markers, articulating through language the mystery of his identity as both the Son of Man and YHVH incarnate.
This is blowing my mind. So when we read the Gospels and notice Jesus switching between I and the Son of Man, we're actually seeing his dual nature expressed through grammar.
That's the argument, yes. And it makes sense when you consider the broader biblical context. In Zechariah, we see this same pattern with divine speech.
Let's talk about Zechariah specifically. What's happening there that connects to this pattern?
Zechariah is particularly rich because it's dealing with post-exilic restoration. According to James Vanderkam's research, the prophecies of Zechariah are one of the most important sources for understanding the high priest's status during the return to Zion.
And Joshua the high priest figures prominently in these visions, right?
Yes. Vanderkam notes that Joshua is named in chapters 3 and 6, and chapter 4 represents him as one of the two sons of oil. But here's what's fascinating. The much disputed oracle in Zechariah 6 Ges 9:15 speaks of crowns for Joshua and for someone termed branch.
Branch, that's a messianic title, isn't it?
Exactly. And according to Luke Shorey's recent research on Christological typology in Zechariah, the prophet's visions project a theological world that anticipates the union of priestly and royal offices in the Messiah.
So Zechariah is setting up this expectation of someone who would be both priest and king?
Right. Shorey argues that Zechariah's visions transcend their post-exilic historical setting to articulate a messianic trajectory fulfilled in Jesus Christ. The text shapes a typological pattern where the priest-king secures covenantal preservation through sacrificial suffering.
And this connects to the third-person speech pattern. How?
Because when divine figures in Zechariah use third-person self-reference, they're asserting both their transcendence and their authority. It's the same pattern Jesus uses when he speaks of divine prerogatives.
Okay, but let's talk about Jude for a moment. How does this show up there?
In Jude 14, we see Enoch prophesying, "Look, the Lord is coming with thousands and thousands of his holy ones." According to William Wenstrom's exegesis, this is describing the judgment at the second advent of Jesus Christ.
So Jude is quoting an ancient prophecy about Jesus coming in judgment.
Exactly. And notice the language, "The Lord is coming." It's third-person reference to divine authority and judgment. Wenstrom notes, this compares the judgment with every unrepentant person living when Jesus Christ returns to earth.
So even in Jude, we're seeing this pattern where divine authority and judgment are expressed through third-person language.
Right. And it's worth noting that Elijah's research found that the Iliism of Yahweh and Jesus share common characteristics: prominence of occurrences, shifting between first and third person, a variety of distinct self-references, and similar rhetorical intent.
That's a pretty specific set of shared characteristics. It suggests this isn't accidental.
Absolutely not accidental. According to Elijah's conclusions, the evidence suggests that a royal and divine theme may be associated with the third-person self-references of both Yahweh and Jesus.
So when Jesus uses third-person self-reference, he's essentially claiming the same kind of authority that Yahweh claims in the Old Testament?
That's what the linguistic evidence suggests. It's a subtle but powerful way of asserting divine identity without making explicit claims that might have been immediately controversial.
That's actually brilliant from a communication standpoint. He's making the claim, but in a way that requires people to think about what he's really saying.
Exactly. And it fits with the broader pattern we see in Jesus' teaching, using parables, metaphors, and linguistic structures that reveal truth to those who are paying attention while concealing it from those who aren't.
You know what's interesting? This reminds me of how kids naturally talk about themselves in third person. Like Elmo saying, "Elmo wants a cookie," instead of "I want a cookie."
That's actually mentioned in Malone's research. Children have referred to themselves in the third person for generations, typically copying their parents' simplification of speech. But the biblical usage is much more sophisticated and intentional.
Right, because Jesus isn't simplifying his speech, he's making it more complex and meaningful.
Precisely. And unlike modern politicians who might use third-person self-reference for ego or distance, Jesus is using it to communicate theological truth about his nature and mission.
So what does this mean for how we read Scripture today? How should understanding this pattern change our approach?
It means we should pay attention to the grammar, not just the content. When Jesus switches from first to third person, he's often shifting from speaking about his human experience to his divine authority.
That's a completely different way of reading the Gospels. Instead of just focusing on what Jesus says, we need to notice how he says it.
Exactly. The linguistic choices are theological choices. According to Garza's research, this alternation functions as a linguistic reflection of the hypostatic union. the coexistence of full divinity and full humanity in one person.
And this isn't just academic speculation. This has real implications for understanding who Jesus claimed to be.
Absolutely. When Jesus says the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, he's not just claiming authority, he's claiming divine authority using the same linguistic pattern that Yahweh uses in the Old Testament.
So when you step back from all this linguistic analysis, here's what really matters. Jesus wasn't just a great teacher or moral example. His own speech patterns reveal he understood himself to possess divine authority.
Right. And what's remarkable is how this pattern appears consistently across different biblical books and contexts. It's not just the Gospels, we see it in the prophetic literature too.
The consistency is what makes it so compelling. This isn't a random quirk, it's a deliberate theological communication strategy that spans centuries of biblical literature.
Exactly. And for modern readers, recognizing this pattern helps us understand that the biblical authors were incredibly sophisticated in how they communicated theological truth through language itself.
Here's what I find most fascinating. This research shows that theology isn't just about big concepts and doctrines. It's embedded in the very grammar and word choices of Scripture.
That's a profound insight. The medium really is part of the message. When Jesus chooses to say, the Son of Man, instead of I, he's not just referring to himself, he's making a theological statement about his identity and authority.
So the next time you're reading the Gospels and notice Jesus talking about himself in the third person, pay attention. You're not just reading about what he did, you're seeing how he understood his own divine nature expressed through the very structure of his speech. And remember that puzzling question we started with, why Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer instead of I must suffer? Now you know it's not puzzling at all. It's Jesus claiming divine authority while speaking about his human mission. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts.